Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing a topic which we have discussed a number of times in this show, but we're going to try to group it into one because seemingly health officials around the world are also doing that. So I'm talking about certainly the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that is, as well as climate change, and certainly the health effects that the pandemic has is quite obvious, but even climate change, which unfortunately is not as discussed at this point in time, at least because of the pandemic, that is also very important and detrimental to global health. There are a number of reports that have come out. So when it comes to the pandemic, we now know that wealthy countries may very well, by the end of this year, have about, what, 1 billion plus COVID-19 vaccines at their disposal, those of which are not going to then be donated to other countries specifically. On top of that, then, the G20 health ministers, though, have recently met, and they've discussed a mutual pact to then distribute vaccines to poorer countries around the world, because as we keep being told, unless and until everyone is vaccinated, the pandemic will very much still stay around, and variants will continue to come up, such as Delta and other variants that we've been speaking of recently. On top of that, we've also had in Italy, at this very meeting that I'm discussing, talk about a One Health approach. And that's an interesting approach, which acknowledges that humans, animals, and the environment are interconnected. And this approach then seeks to mitigate future crises, even though there's not great details about what exactly that approach may be. And then finally, and we may not get to all of these points, but I think it's important to mention this, is that around 200 medical journals have warned that global warming is very much also a really relevant crisis at this point in time, and should also be dealt with simultaneously while the pandemic is being dealt with as well, because it is causing, in many of these experts' minds and opinions, the same sort of damage, possibly, that the pandemic is causing around the world. And I'm speaking here in health terms, certainly. Let's discuss all of these points a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Kerry Bowman, who is a professor at the Departments of Family and Community Medicine and School of Environment at the University of Toronto. He's joining us this morning from Toronto, Ontario. Joining us from Lancaster, the UK, is Dr. Munir, who is a virologist. He's a lecturer in biomedicine at Lancaster University. Mohammed and Kerry, thank you both for taking our time out of your no doubt busy schedules to speak to us today. Kerry, I'd like to start with you. So I'll start right at the top when it comes to the vaccines, right? So 1 billion plus approximately is the estimation that may exist in these wealthy countries' hands as a surplus vaccines, and these are not marked to be donated. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a horrible situation that many vaccines would be existing within high-income countries. You know, the lack of global coordination in this pandemic and the lack of global commitment to the world in this pandemic has been an ethical failure. It's also an epidemiological failure, because we're not dealing with the greatest threat, which is, in fact, as you clearly said in your introduction, these emerging variants that continue to come towards us. Awful situation. I'm a little bit heartened by the fact that vaccine production is now escalating to a very high point. So hopefully there will just be so many vaccines that things will improve. But boy, we're very slow out of the gate on this one.
You know, Mohammed, I believe in an earlier conversation we had last time we spoke, we did talk about the fact that there was vaccine, hoarding on the part of many rich countries. What are your thoughts on that now? As Kerry there said, there is some hope, right, where there is vaccine production increasing. And can we take hope from the fact that the G20 health ministers have said there will be a pact?
Absolutely. I think there is no doubt that the vaccine production is really increasing significantly. But actually, the problem is not just the supply of the vaccine. Distribution of the vaccine is also equally important, and infrastructure within the poor economy isn't really supportive enough to distribute the vaccine in relatively shorter time. And out of the total vaccine production, around 2.8 billion has been already pledged by the tech economies. And out of those, around 1.8 billion doses are the ones that are not required. And 1.8 billion doses are enough to vaccinate the whole of Africa, which is at the moment have only less than 5%. And only 0.2% of the low middle income countries particularly at the down end of the low economies, are vaccinated at this moment. So even if the supply is higher, certainly a cooperation, not the competition, is required to distribute at the scale which is needed to really curtail this pandemic.
You know, Kerry, there's been a lot of criticism, right, from the WHO as well as pretty much everybody else of politicians and the fact that there's been this sort of vaccine hoarding that's brought us to this point that we're speaking of now. Is this more than, do you think, the political push, which is pushing all these politicians into then making these decisions about pacts and making these grand promises about vaccine distributions around the world? As Mohammed there said, there is then this Herculean task of actually then distributing it.
Yeah, and Mohammed is exactly right. I mean, first you need supply and then you need distribution. And you know, I personally work in the Western Amazon. I also work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And just considering the challenges with this in terms of as well people's own concerns and knowledge of vaccines is going to be huge. It's going to be huge. But, you know, getting production up to scale is at least a good starting point. And it's very, very important. And again, and I realize I'm probably already repeating myself, but the lack of global leadership on this, there has not been a country, there has not been a person, you know, the WHO to some extent, but they got so discredited in the early days that it actually did a lot of damage under the Trump government. But the lack of global coordination on this is a huge stumbling point.
So, Mohammed, with this meeting that we had, right, of the G20 health ministers, how much hope do you think that there is now, as Kerry there correctly pointed out, in world leaders doing now the right thing, coming together and doing the right thing? Are you seeing the signs in that regard, beyond just rhetoric, of course?
Well, absolutely. I think we have had a quite high commitment from the beginning of this pandemic, but actually when it comes to practice, when it comes to reality, that is not really translated. I know G20, particularly with the Gordon Brown, has been very proactive on to equitable distribution of the vaccine, but literally little has been done so far. But what I can look at the bit positive side is that most of the countries in the thick economies, they are already reaching to their saturation level. The supply of the vaccine is more than what they need. So I think there would be some natural tendency to redistribute back into the countries where it has not yet been distributed at the moment. For example, if you look onto the figures of most of the European countries, around 60% has been vaccinated. UK particularly, we have 80% of the population is vaccinated, while we have at least 56 million surplus of those vaccines. So hopefully by natural tendency, that vaccine would be rolled back into the developing countries, the countries who cannot afford. So I'm seeing a little glimpse of the positivity. However, until it is not really translated, it's very hard to count on.
And then, Kerry, you know, I wanted to get to this important notion of actually connecting, right, the pandemic and what's happening with also climate change, right? Because we are also, and legitimately so, distracted by the pandemic and dealing with that, even governments around the world, that there hasn't been enough concentration, even climate scientists' eyes, as I imagine you may agree, on climate change as well, and the health effects, the detrimental health effects this has on millions, on billions possibly around the world. What are your thoughts on that really important need to connect these and to make climate change as well in people's mind just as much of alarm bells going off?
Yeah, I mean, the scenario you've just outlined is the most important consideration of them all. You know, we've really lost the thread with a lot of the pandemic. The climate crisis is far more serious than this pandemic. And look, there is clearly a relationship between environmental degradation and this pandemic. That, you know, the relationships are quite complex. Zoonotic diseases, the destruction of forests, animal species moving to new terrain because of a changing climate. There's actually a lot of environmental antecedents to this. So this is critically important. And, you know, it's wonderful that this has been acknowledged. I think it's fabulous. But when I look to the many people in my country and countries all over the world that are offering expertise on the pandemic, you know, this is rarely mentioned. And one of the things that scares me a little bit is we have not really risen globally to the pandemic challenge. And the only way to deal with the global and, warming and climate challenge is globally. So it's not such a great indicator that we haven't done that well on the pandemic. It may mean we're going to have greater challenges with the bigger threats that lie ahead of us. So I think it's very important we lay down infrastructure now.
Mohammed, what are your thoughts about that, as a health expert yourself, too? I mean, how important is it to also bring climate change into the conversation, considering the very detrimental health effects?
Well, having my virology knowledge hat on, I can clearly see that the global warming has really a great impact onto the disease emergence. I mean, if we look onto some of the examples, most of the time when we see Ebola outbreaks, that always come when there is a dry season, when animals from different origin, different species, they come together and they exchange viruses. And that's how most of the emerging infections are started. And then globalization, all of these are compounding effect that can lead to very quick distribution of these diseases and have a global impact. So certainly anything that can help into minimizing the impact of the global warming certainly would be helpful, particularly on the infectious disease perspective.
So, Kerry, if we're talking about more specifics, right, when dealing with climate change, for example, and the health effects from it, am I right to say that we're basically talking about respiratory illnesses? I mean, or is that much too much of a generalization of what the detrimental health effects may be?
It's not really too much. It's one of the more immediate effects. And certainly, I'm in North America, and with the kind of heat and fires that we have been through over the last few months as summer has passed, that's been massive. But look, when we begin to look at human health in relation to the environmental situation and the environmental crisis, it's a huge, long list of concerns of emerging zoonotic diseases. There's air, there's fire, there's heat. They're very complex equations, but there's a multitude of them, believe me. And I'm not expressing a personal opinion. There's growing literature on this.
And Mohammed, there, as you pointed out, there's even I believe there's arguments, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not an expert on this, but there are arguments that that what we're seeing with the pandemic may have been at some level, or at least the way it spread, a result of global warming and climate change.
Yes, absolutely, Waqar. This is really important that most of the pandemics that we have seen have some impact by the climate. For example, putting specifically this COVID-19 into perspective, certainly bats population, which are very likely source of this virus or stew, could have somehow been impacted by the environment, came very close to either the livestock or to the human where the virus has been passed on. And that impact is really then led to the emergence of this virus so quickly, so lavishly that we are in this situation at the moment. And putting into the perspective, we have around 60% of infection in human came from animal. And that figure and that ratio is increasing day by day because our contact with animal is increasing, and it's not just because we are getting closer to them, it's because animals are getting closer to us as well, just because of the environmental impact onto them.
I wonder, Kerry, around you, are there alarm bells going off? Because, just in Canada this year, right, we had what was in British Columbia, a town in British Columbia, where the record heats, there was a record heat wave, and I believe there were heat waves in other places in Canada as well, and certainly in other places in the Western world also. Are there alarm bells going off? Are there policies in play that will be enacted to deal with that sort of thing?
There's very slowly alarm bells going off, but there's still a lack of really focusing on the big picture, as Mohammed has just very, very well described. And I don't mean to put anyone down, but some of the top leaders in my country and other countries, they're actually really not aware of these kind of environmental niches and interfaces, and so the discourse to the public has been limited. But look, the crisis in Canada, not only were heat records broken, they were broken by 8.5 degrees. I mean, when heat records are broken, they're usually broken at less than 1 degree. It was massive and extreme, and that part of Canada is not normally that hot. Most of the heat tends to be where I am in southern Ontario, towards the center of the country. So very unprecedented. And the fires were phenomenal and did a lot of damage to people's health and infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's key, isn't it, Mohammed? That it seems that a lot of politicians too do not, in fact, appreciate or even possibly understand the entire impact. And secondly, there's a lot of pessimism, right, when it comes to climate change. The way we talk about climate change is always in very negative terms, and there's very little in the way of hope in that regard. Is that also important? Do we need to maybe change the way we talk about this so that there's practical solutions given?
Yes, absolutely, Waqar. I mean, I'm not a politician, so therefore it's hard for me to comment on politics. But looking on to the infectious disease spread perspective and how they pass on from one generation to another generation and from one continent to another continent, these are majority of these infections that we are worried about. These are transboundary infection, do not respect the border. So any policy that is made in one continent is not really sufficient enough to tackle the global perspective of global diseases. It has to be tackled at the global level, the scale and the threat they can have onto the global scale. And I agree to Kerry. I sit into the WHO expert panel on animal models and also the vaccines for COVID-19. And I can clearly see that there are gaps that are not really articulated very well, not only within the government, but also the general public. So I think this pandemic has revealed quite a lot of gaps and caveats that need to be filled in coming months or so, because the threat for these infections will always be there. This is not the last pandemic. We're going to see more and more. And until we don't really act in timely manner at the global scale with a lot of cooperation, we cannot really avoid these pandemics.
So right to say, Kerry, and this seems like quite a logical question, but am I right to say that an organization like the WHO really needs to be empowered? Because as you correctly there said, there's been a lot of criticism of the WHO and the way it's dealt with this pandemic, or not. I mean, in many people's eyes. Is that the only fora, or does there need to be another fora, possibly created, a forum created, where these sorts of things are dealt with? Because as Mohammed there said, if down the road or very soon we're expecting more on the horizon, then we really need strong leadership, medical leadership, global health leadership in this regard.
I think we all need to give the WHO credit for the great work that they have done. I mean, here in North America, where I am, we're not Americans, but certainly early in the pandemic, the anger towards the WHO and the relationship with China, much of which I actually think may have been unfounded. I know it's a complicated question, but we don't have the global infrastructure. I work a lot and focus a lot in wildlife trade and markets, and I was actually in Wuhan market, saw 56 species of animals for sale, 2/3 of which were wild. This is before the pandemic broke. And we really don't have the kind of overall infrastructure for things like wildlife trade. We don't have the overall infrastructure for things like tropical forest regulation and protection. And when you think of the complexities of all of that, and to drop that into the lap of WHO with no additional funding is really asking a lot. So I don't know the ins and outs of it, but WHO will need to be bolstered, and we may need to add on layers and satellites of programs, because we do not have a clear global view of the threats that are in front of us.
Ahmed, what do you make of global leadership? I'm talking about health leadership or lack of, be it WHO or others.
Well, absolutely. There is no doubt, Kerry, that WHO is probably the only global leadership we have in the pandemic control and any of the crises that we have had. But WHO itself is suffering from a lot of financial constraints and also political constraint as well. When, for example, US pulled out of the WHO funding regime, it was very difficult for WHO to stand on its feet at the time when it was needed the most in the middle of the pandemic. So certainly this is the only organization we can trust on, we can count on for handling these crises. But at the same time, the COVID-19 has itself revealed so many problems within our healthcare system, not only in the developed nation, but also have highlighted further down into the developing nation. So all that need to be accounted for. And now, of course, we need to learn from this pandemic. We need to transit in a way that we are better prepared for the future diseases which are inevitable.
All right, Kerry, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. On then the lessons that have been learned, do you think that politicians, global health leadership will properly then learn from that, and now we will not repeat the same mistakes?
I hope they will. I hope they will. I mean, what I see in North America is a lot of emergence of people saying, well, we need better surveillance for emerging pandemics. Surveillance is not prevention. So we do need better surveillance. We need to watch to see what viruses are emerging where, when, and how to intervene. We have to go further upstream than that. We have to look at what caused this in the first place. That's where we have to go. And I do hope as the pandemic wanes, I'm not suggesting it's waning now. I wish I could suggest that, but it's obviously not true. We can do that. Let me just say very, very finally, where I find encouragement is there's such a generational element to this. I teach students, and I'm often around children, and their level of environmental commitment and awareness and global awareness, it's very, very heartening to see. And I have great hope in them to make some significant changes, and us as well.
Well, and I'm glad we could end it there on a fairly positive note. We appreciate both Kerry and Mohammed for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their expert insight with us. It was really important to discuss that, right? Because that connection between climate change and the pandemic is not often discussed. Climate change, in fact, isn't really discussed much when it comes to health issues overall, at least in mainstream media around the world, enough at least. And that's something that even, as I said, 200 medical journals have called for that sort of parallel comparison to be made, and that the climate change crisis is just as much of a crisis in their minds as the pandemic is, and needs to be dealt with as much fervor as everybody is dealing with the pandemic with, because this will have certainly health complications and health effects for all of us, but also economic, right? Because all these heat waves and flooding and et cetera that we've seen around the world just over the past year or so, they all have economic effects too, because they stop businesses in some way or another, and that hurts all of us at some point in time with the trickle-down and globalized economy and health system that we're all living in at this point in time. I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss news coming out of the UK, and a number of such news pieces have come out over the past number of years about racism and extremism within UK classrooms. And one would think that this is probably an issue in many places around the world as well. But this report is quite wide-ranging. So it talks about extremism, such as Islamophobia, i.e. racism of different kinds, not just Islamophobia, certainly, as well as also far-right extremism, and those views then being expressed by pupils within England, more specifically. But as I said, such a report, unfortunately, is not completely surprising, because it does seem that what parents espouse at some point in time and speak of as far as rhetoric goes probably does then pass on to children, as well as, of course, media, social media, certainly online as well, with a lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing going around these days, especially, again, in the context of the pandemic. So let's discuss a bit of that further. We're now joined by Dr. Saeed Khan, who is a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University. He's currently joining us from Lisbon in Portugal. Saeed, as always, we appreciate your taking our time out to speak to us here in Scope. This is quite sad, isn't it, in the sense that we have pupils speaking of such things, expressing far-right views, Islamophobic views, even misogynistic views.
It's always a shock, particularly when one thinks that we should evolve as a people, as a society, in recognizing that racism is wrong. There is so much social justice activity that occurs. And yet at the same time, we are always addled with the idea that young people espouse views that before would only be thought of as coming from the mouths of adults. Now, one of the problems is not just the fact that they may be learning it passively from adults. With the advent of social media, now I'm afraid there's the possibility that they are seeking validation for pre-existing racist sentiment, and the idea of the self and the other being placed in opposition to one another. And as you rightly said, there is this element that anything goes, that people can speak their truth. And if that truth includes, of course, bigotry and racism, In some cases, not only is it not condemned, it's in fact encouraged, and it's in fact even rewarded by the number of likes or the number of hits somebody gets, depending on the social media platform in which they're engaging in that toxic rhetoric.
You know, we've discussed before, I believe, Saeed, about education and the kind of role that education can play in bettering our society and fixing any extreme views, be they far right or otherwise. In this case, in this report, it speaks about how teachers, for example, in England, are ill-prepared, in fact, to deal with such issues. I would think that that is probably, again, the case in many places around the world. How much of an obstacle then is that? Because if the very educators who are meant to be hopefully, correcting these views aren't able to do so or don't know how to do so, what then should we do?
We've seen examples where sometimes it is simply incidental, it is accidental, it is not intended to provoke. There was the case of, in England, as a matter of fact, a teacher who showed some rather disturbing images of the Prophet Muhammad, which was seen then, of course, as being insensitive to Muslim students. Now, that created, of course, quite a bit of outrage because as it went viral and people found out about it, there became this campaign on social media which amplified what otherwise would have probably been an incident that could have been addressed and rectified locally. So that kind of multiplier effect where everything, even local, becomes global is problematic. Some teachers, of course, then have to literally walk on eggshells in trying to understand in this new parlance what are the triggers that different students might have in a multicultural and in a diverse society as a place like England would have. But at the same time, what is perhaps lacking in the classroom and in the curriculum is a more honest assessment of what has been the historical arc of a country like Great Britain when it comes to its colonial experience and when it comes to the kind of systemic and institutionalized racism that not only was conducted during the colonial era, but many would argue is still occurring in society. And so when we have that cognitive dissonance and also this idea of willful neglect of the historical record, trying to preserve, in fact, and protect elements of the history which really don't deserve that kind of immunity, then we run into the problem of people being able to find other narratives about society and calling out teachers, challenging them and saying, well, you must be part of the problem, that you are not addressing these issues. You're no better than the bigots that we have learned on our own as being part of this problem.
Is this, and I want to carefully word this question, Saeed, is this, do you think, a question of liberal versus conservative views? Or is this, in fact, just a discussion of extremism in its truest regards? Because many would argue, as I'm sure you can appreciate in Europe, and I would think even in the United States to an extent, that, listen, just because we have a far-right view, or what you and I and others would define as a far-right view, that doesn't necessarily mean that us or our children are not allowed to speak of such views. I mean, this is, these countries, their value of free speech is very important. How does one then deal with that, right? Because you don't want to completely turn off conservatives either. It's not like saying to all conservatives that your views are not welcome in the classroom.
I don't know if the labels liberal and conservative even have much value anymore, Waqar, in this conversation. There was recently a cover story in The Economist about the dangers of the illiberal left, as it says, in policing speech and policing language. Now, of course, language is oftentimes, and especially free speech and free expression, is oftentimes touted by liberals as being a virtue, as being a principle worth defending, protecting, and championing. And yet at the same time, if it is the left that is seen as now controlling speech, something that conservatives will certainly use as a critique of the left, that means that the line is blurred between the kind of venom that is deployed against the left as being not dissimilar to the kind of venom that is deployed in the other direction. The only thing that seems to change is what is acceptable as a legitimate form of hate. Now, the conservative side of the argument will claim that white privilege is simply a code for demonizing the entire white population of a society, that it is just a simple reductive way of stereotyping and generalizing an entire group of people, oftentimes on socioeconomic level, mocking, for example, in the United States, people who voted for Trump, questioning their sanity, questioning their intellect. Same thing when it comes to people who operate from a particular religious affiliation as the base of their morals and their ethics. If that is seen then as fair game to mock, if that is seen as fair game to insult, then it seems as though there's very little subtlety and distinction when the left feels as though it is being demonized for its values and its championing of diversity.
Multiculturalism for so long, Saeed, has been sold as this wonderful thing, and I would argue, and I'm sure you would as well, that it is a wonderful thing in many, many regards. But on the other side, the argument is, for those who are critical of it, that listen, in fact, what's happening, such as, for example, in this report, proves that you should not have too much of mixing of different people, of different races, faiths, ethnicities, etc., because they do not integrate, assimilate, blend together well many, many times. Is this sort of thing proving that? Because we do have, if we're completely honest, a hardening of those sorts of positions in many, especially Western societies.
Well, this is the bane of identity politics. Multiculturalism per se meant that there was going to be more than just tolerance, but an acknowledgement and a respect for difference. That everyone's culture, everyone's distinctiveness was going to be held in regard. It was going to be held at parity, and no one was going to make a value judgment of creating social hierarchy, where one religion is better than another, one race is better than another, or socioeconomic station and status would prevail one over another. Unfortunately, what we find with multiculturalism in the way that it is critiqued now, as far as its discontents go, is by this hierarchy, by the stratification that as in Animal Farm by George Orwell, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And it seems as though this conceit has somehow the other made its way into our politics and into our social engagement of the day. Somehow the other, those who speak with certain accents, and it doesn't even have to be a so-called foreign ethnic accent. In the United States, a Southern accent, for example, is oftentimes attributed to be someone who is less intelligent than someone else. Similarly, those who tend to be more religiously observant are somehow the other looked down upon by those who are secular. And of course, that works in the other direction as well. The idea of live and let live, which was the real promise of multiculturalism, seems to be in grave danger right now.
And so now, as a final comment, Saeed, I wanted to use an example specifically from the U.S., where there's a huge debate, as you well know, about critical race theory, about whether or not it should be taught in classrooms, you know, and the positions are very, very strong on the other side as well against it. Is it important, and I don't want to talk just about critical race theory, but is it important to have those sorts of debates and then to have if it implemented then in classrooms? Is that then the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to specifically education and how to overcome these sorts of hatreds?
It is, Waqar, provided that that tunnel is not just a social media tunnel. Unfortunately, these debates are very complex. They are very nuanced. They are very subtle. And at the risk of sounding elitist about it, they are not necessarily meant to be debated and deliberated in the court of public opinion because of their complexity. Many people who either extol critical race theory in the example that you gave or condemn it don't really know what critical race theory is. There are plenty of memes that go about. For example, critical race theory is the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is Karl Marx, because Marxism is, of course, the big demon for the conservative right. That is a fine stretch that people are conducting. It would be better if we could find a safe space for those who really understand these topics to not only deliberate them, but to go ahead then and create a narrative about them which can then reach the public and provide for the kind of consumption that they desperately need, instead of, again, just reducing these things to memes and political weaponization.
That's a very good point, and Saeed. We really appreciate your taking your time out during your travels. That was Saeed Khan speaking to us today from Lisbon in Portugal. He was sharing his expert insight with us about this report that's come out of England. But as I said, this probably reality does exist in many schools and classrooms in many significant places around the world, especially in multicultural societies, where pupils are now espousing far-right views, extremist views, Islamic views, racist views, misogynistic views. I mean, the list is quite endless, in fact, when you read this report. And teachers then are admitting that either they're scared to deal with this sort of thing because they feel that they're going to be called out and or their careers are going to be on the line, or they're just not prepared or just don't know or don't have the weapons or ammunition, if I may use those terms, to be able to deal with this sort of situation. And this is worrying, right? Because this is the next generation we're talking about. So if pupils in a multicultural society like England are espousing these views and teachers cannot deal with that, what then is the hope for other societies around the world as well? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.